Good evening, everybody, and thank you for having me, and I'm thrilled to be a part of this panel. I have had both of these men on my radio show, and I enjoy dialoguing with them a great deal, and I will tonight. I'm debating whether it's moral to react to anything that Christopher said, since he went first and he had nothing to react to what we said, so I will choose the easy way out and both react to what he said and offer some other thoughts. And I will react immediately in this way. He said, and if I jotted it down quickly enough, if you are prepared to believe that, namely that there is a good God who governs the universe, created human beings, and so on, then you are prepared to believe absolutely anything. In reality, what I have found in my life is that the people who are most prepared to believe anything idiotic are the secular. In the United States of America and Western Europe, you are far more likely to believe nonsense if you are a secular human than if you are a religious Jew or Christian. The nonsense that religious Jews or Christians may believe in, and even assuming it is nonsense, is quite constricted to a handful of theological premises. But if I had to bet my entire, well, I was going to say my house mortgage, but it's right now, given the housing crisis, that there wouldn't be much to bet. But in any event, if I had to bet everything that I have on the following proposition, that if you took 1,000 American college students who were regular church attenders and 1,000 completely secular college students from the same socioeconomic backgrounds and asked them a whole host of questions, it is no doubt in my mind, and no doubt in my mind that Christopher Hitchens would find that the answers given by the ones who went to church were far more rational. For example, when I went to Columbia University, a bastion of secular thought, I was told as a given that men and women were basically the same. You had to be secular and intellectual to believe such drivel. Religious people knew this was nonsense. Today, I believe that the hysteria over global warming is indeed hysteria. You are far more likely to believe that hysteria if you are secular than if you are religious. G.K. Chesterton was entirely right, entirely, that when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. The track record of the secular world's belief in idiocy overwhelms the Judeo-Christian world's beliefs in idiocy. And that's the only world that I am defending tonight, and specifically the Jewish one, the Jewish conception of God. But I will take the Judeo-Christian, Western European, and American right now as my model for a person who is far more likely to believe rationally about life and morally about life. I was also taught at Columbia University that the United States and the Soviet Union were morally equivalent. Religious people didn't believe that, by and large. The secular believed that. As for the track record of morality, which we'll get to later, the secular make most religious people look like Boy Scouts. The record of secular, of atheistic murder, torture, mass murder, and mass torture dwarfs all the religions in all of history combined. And that's in only 100 years of communism and Nazism. So I don't know where he got that from. If his issue is who's more likely to have rational conclusions about life, he has no good neighbors. He is stuck with a world that when it drops God, it drops wisdom. There are good people who are atheists, and there are twits who are religious. But there is no wisdom in the atheist and secular worlds. None. That is why we live in the age of stupidity in America today. The age that does believe that if you give a girl trucks, she will grow up to play with trucks. And if you give a boy dolls, he will grow up to play with dolls. Only the secular believe that. The religious scratch their heads how people could believe such nonsense. Now, as to the larger issue of God's existence. To be an atheist is to believe that everything came from nothing. Since I cannot prove God, and he cannot disprove God, and he cannot prove how anything came about, we now enter the world of only common sense and likelihood. On the issue of common sense and likelihood, I simply ask you if you believe that it is more likely that everything, and I mean everything, came about on its own. That is what Christopher Hitchens and all atheists believe. It all came about on its own. But nothing physical comes from nothing. Nothing does. So it is a leap of faith that absolutely dwarfs my leap of faith, and I acknowledge it's a leap of faith that there is a good God who governs the universe. I fully do. I accept Rabbi Milton Steinberg's great statement, which I will offer as in just a nutshell form. I will paraphrase. The believer in God has to account for one thing: the existence of unjust suffering. The atheist, however, has to account for the existence of everything else. That is so powerful to me as to be inherently persuasive. I fully acknowledge the weakness in the religious belief. I fully acknowledge it. That if I believe there is a God, I have to somehow deal with children with cancer and tsunamis and so on. And every religious person acknowledges that difficulty, or every thinking religious person. But the atheist has to account for everything else. We went from nothing to Bach is a belief that he has. That's rational. We're the ones who make strange, irrational leaps of faith, not the atheist. Yes, we went from absolutely nothing, or even for that matter, from a rock to Beethoven's Ninth on its own. Okay, if you believe that, I conclude, then you are absolutely prepared to believe anything.
Jody mentioned in the introduction my past as a little bit of a troublemaker in my college days. I remember we used to tell the deans that taking on our conservative campus newspaper was a bit like wrestling with a pig. Not only did it get everyone dirty, but the pig liked it. Now, we, the three of us on this podium, I believe we have a couple of things in common. First of all, I think we are all of, for all our differences, we are of one mind on the subject of Islamic radicalism and terrorism. Since we all are relatively open-minded, we believe in keeping channels of open communication with the Islamic radicals, and this open communication, I think, should take the form of live ammunition. Now, I believe in a sense it is not inaccurate to say also that all three of us are in a certain way agnostics. And what I mean by that is that there is a difference between religious belief and rational knowledge. I would say, for example, that I believe in God, but I wouldn't say I believe in my brother. I know the guy. So you believe when you don't know. In that sense, we are all in a field of open inquiry, using the same tools. Inference to the best explanation, history, philosophy, science, and so on. Christopher Hitchens began by posing what is to me a very striking question. He said, isn't it odd that you've got 100,000 years of uneventful history, and then suddenly God appears to jump in the picture? And suddenly, if you will, the religious story gets going. I would submit that even if you took God out of the picture completely, the puzzle remains. If we've been on this planet for 100,000 years as Darwinian primates, having pretty much the same brains that we have now, why is it the case that for 95,000 of those years man accomplished virtually nothing? Not having invented a wheel, not having come up with a cave painting even. And then suddenly, 5,000 years ago, history gets started. History gets started in a lot of different places. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, everybody starts inventing stuff. It does appear as if some sort of a transcendent breath may have grabbed a couple of those Darwinian primates and breathed something we might call a soul into them. This would explain things a lot better, wouldn't it? Now, I'd like to say a little bit about myself. I'd like to say a little bit about God. I'd like to say a little bit about Christianity. I'd like to say a little bit about Jesus. In my own case, I'm a little bit of an oddity. I come from Bombay, India. My family is from a part of India called Goa. I was born Christian. The reason for this is the Portuguese missionaries dropped in on us a few hundred years ago, and they came with a Bible in one hand and a bayonet in the other. They were extremely persuasive. And yet, so I was raised Christian, but this is a point I want to make about the nature of religious belief. A lot of us learn our Christianity, our Judaism, when we are very young. We learn a Christianity adapted to our young mind when we are 5 or 7 or 8 years old. This is what I call crayon Christianity. It's a simplified idea of God as a big man with a Santa Claus beard and so on. Now, this is the Christianity we take to college, where we meet the younger versions of Christopher Hitchens in the form of graduate students, sometimes young professors, and they pelt your religious belief with skepticism. How can you believe this? Miracles, isn't that ridiculous in an age of science and so on? So many of us find that we can't answer those objections at a young age, and we find ourselves pulling away from our faith, from our religious convictions. This is not because those objections cannot be answered. We simply don't know the answers at that point in life. So in some senses, it is only in adult life that I have thought about those same questions and come to a certain adult or mature theism, very different from the beliefs I held when I was 8. And this theism, I think Dennis and I in some ways want to show, can withstand the skeptical assault and meet it on its own ground. I want to say in the short time I have left, I've got to adopt the motto here that King Henry VIII used with one of his wives. He said, "I shouldn't keep you too long." So I want to make one, if I may, scientific argument for God's existence. In recent decades, leading scientists have asked a very interesting question. The universe as we know it operates according to some very fixed numerical values. I'm not talking about our planet, the universe as a whole. The gravitational force is so strong, the electromagnetic force is so strong, the strong nuclear force, the so-called electroweak force, and so on and so on. One physicist, Lee Smolin, describes it as God is sitting at a desk with 100 different dials, every dial set to a very definite and precise number. So the scientists asked this question: what if we were to alter the dials a little bit, fool with them, not a whole lot? What would happen? Stephen Hawking discusses this question in A Brief History of Time, and he notes that if you touch one of the dials and move it, he's talking about the rate of expansion of the universe, move it not 10%, not 1%, but 1 part in 100,000 millionth, we would have no universe. We would have no life. The entire universe needs to be as big as it is and as old as it is and to have precisely the values that it does, or else we would not be having this conversation. The whole universe appears to be a giant conspiracy to produce, well, us. This argument has put modern atheism completely on the defensive, and I also want to say it is an argument immune to Darwinian attack. So I'm delighted to be here and look forward to a skeptical exchange on these issues. I think at the end of the day, we're all going to be saying, thank God for religion, and specifically, thank God for Christianity. Thank you. it is in some senses true that all religions, and by the way, this is no less true of atheism or secularism, claim an exclusive claim to truth. If atheism is true, no religion can possibly be true.
That's quite right.
So atheism in that sense is just as parochial in asserting the falsity of every competing faith. Second, Christianity is probably the only religion that declares another religion to be completely true, and that is Judaism. Christianity is built, you might say, on the foundation of Judaism and intends to incorporate it unedited, the whole thing. Third, even within Catholicism, there is something that actually ranks higher than the Pope and higher than all the encyclicals, and that is the inner voice of conscience. This is asserted in numerous ways, but it is a doctrinal teaching that conscience, the little referee, what Adam Smith called the impartial spectator inside of us, that is the ultimate authority.
Is it my turn? All right, so Christopher, I just have a number of questions that would interest me to get your answer to. I fully acknowledge, and so did Dinesh D'Souza at the very outset, that every thinking believer has doubts. Do you ever doubt your atheism?
Well, the practice, the atheist, secularist, materialist practice is based on doubt.
No, you're not answering my question. Do you ever doubt atheism? I sometimes doubt God's existence. Do you ever doubt God's non-existence?
No.
Okay. That is exactly a perfect example.
I mean, I try.
It is a perfect...
I try, but I can't succeed.
All right.
I do my best.
Well, you don't try hard enough.
I give it a try, but it's not possible to...
I know. Well, that is... Look, I appreciate your honesty because...
I think I'm here myself because of the laws of biology and not because of a divine plan. I just haven't got the arrogance to claim that I'm here because God has a plan for me.
On the contrary, you have much more arrogance because of your certitude is greater than ours. We have self-doubt. You do not. You heard that, ladies and gentlemen.
That
is a fact.
You did not make me concede any such thing. You're so glib.
No, you said you...
You're so glib you squeak.
I'm sorry. I asked you, do you ever doubt...
Anything of the sort.
All right.
I said I try,
yes,
but I can't.
Right.
I can't.
So I don't care whether you try or not. The fact is that you never doubt your atheism. We doubt our religiosity.
I cannot come up with...
There is a far more inquiring mind among the thoughtful religious than among, and I will include you, the thoughtful atheists. You are far more dogmatic than we are.
I can't find any merit in, since you're asking me again, I can find no merit in any theistic explanation of my presence here or yours.
Yes, that's a separate question.
I have tried.
Whether you I understand. Whether you find merit or not.
I owe you my best reply.
Okay, so we answered that question. We acknowledge doubts. You acknowledge no doubts. Fine, fair enough. Next question.
No, that's not what I said.
That is what you said. It's on tape and video.
It is not what I said.
It is what you said.
No,
you said you try, but you fail.
No, you're being
said
boring
it 4
as well
times,
as
in
glib.
fact.
You're being boring as well as glib and dishonest too.
Well, all right. Look, people, you will all purchase the CD, and you will. Okay. You said you don't doubt your atheism. All right. We'll leave that point. If you said you did, well, the audience will judge. Next.
A statement that something is doubtless is not a statement of dogma. Okay. I don't doubt the rotundity of the globe.
It's a dogmatic
I don't
outlook.
doubt it.
Right. Okay. We acknowledge more intellectual doubts. It's all I wanted to say because there is an all-pervasive outlook today that it is the atheist who is the open-minded and it is the religious believer who is the closed-minded, and you just heard an example, in my opinion, if you reject it, you reject it, but in my opinion, of a greater open-mindedness to self-doubt and self-inquiry among most religious people than among the atheists.
I don't doubt the theory of natural selection either.
Okay, fine.
I don't doubt it.
That's all right, fine, I understand. I don't doubt that the sun rises in the east. So you
Very
have
good.
the same
now,
certitude about
finally.
that. No, now we're finding nothing.
Thinking.
Okay. Now, you asked about can we come up with any good actions that were done because of religion that wouldn't be done by secularists, and you cannot, one cannot, and if one did, you would give them a prize to be announced later. I will ask for that prize in a moment. And you said, on the other hand, there are evil actions that can only be fostered by religion. I mean, that's beneath you. It's not intellectual. There are evils that have been committed that are horrific by both secularists. I don't know if Gulag came up and the communists came up and Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung in North Korea, who were avowed atheists, came up with less barbaric evils than any medievalist in religion. So this notion that the greatest evils or unique evils come out of religion is just historically inaccurate. I mean, there is despicable, sadistic cruelty everywhere. That's the human condition, unfortunately. Now, I will give you evidence, however, where religion has produced more good than its alternative. And I asked this of two secular professors, Pearl and Sam Oliner, O-L-I-N-E-R, teachers at Humboldt State, California State at Humboldt. And they wrote a book on altruism. There are not many books on altruism. There are 10 billion books on evil, almost none on altruism, which is too bad. And I asked them, they specifically studied rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust. And I said this, and I have it on tape. You have devoted your lives to studying altruism. You are secular.
Mr. Prager, this would be a time to continue with the questioning of
Okay, so this is my final statement to Christopher Hitchens. You are secular. If you could, knowing everything you know now, you are a Jew in the Holocaust, and you can knock on the door of a secular doctor. No, I didn't even say secular. A doctor, a lawyer, or a priest or a nun behind the third door. Which would you knock on in the hope that they would risk their lives to save you? And they said, without question, the priest or nun.
Thank you.
Now to Dinesh. All right, now, the problem with Dinesh is so far we agree on everything. And this is a very serious problem in a debate. You might want your money back, except for two things. One, you paid nothing, and second, that there is always Christopher Hitchens here. So
I would suggest, why don't we move along?
That solves the problem of disagreement.
Dennis, why don't we move along then, and we'll have Dinesh take on his rebuttal.
Well, I did want to still, nevertheless, I did want to ask you
I
something.
didn't feel myself being cross-examined in that last rant, I've got to say.
Yes, so I do want to ask one thing of Dinesh, though. I'll be very...
You do want to do a Pentateuch New Testament kind of conversation?
How about if we give Christopher just a minute to respond,
Let's
and
do
then
that,
and then Dennis can ask me a question,
that,
and then we'll
I
move
think
on.
after this one, we'll sort of be more, throw it open.
Well, you only have to read Primo Levi. At least he'd be the one I think I would probably suggest first, to find out that there's nothing hypothetical about the question that was just asked to me. We know, because so many Jewish people did have to wonder who they could turn to in that moment. And we know exactly what happened when they turned. Oh, well, that's great. So what, the microphone doesn't work either now? There's nothing hypothetical about the last question I was asked when it finally came to a question, because it was the fate of many Jewish people in Europe to have to wonder to whom they could turn in their time of extremity. And I'll tell you the place they didn't turn, which was to the churches that had made the official concordat with Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. The churches that had told their parties to vote for him in the Reichstag, the church that had told, especially the Catholic Church, that had told its bishops to celebrate Adolf Hitler's birthday every year from the pulpit, which they did till April 1945, which had preached the anti-Semitism on which the Nazi Party based itself, which in many cases violated the seal of the confessional to turn over resistors, and in all cases turned over the birth records of the parishes of Bavaria and the rest of Germany, so that the Nuremberg laws could be enforced and everyone with even a particle of Jewish blood could be identified, set aside for deportation and persecution. Anyone who doesn't know this doesn't know anything about it. Not only that, not one person was excommunicated or threatened with excommunication by the church for taking part in the final solution. Paul Johnson, a Roman Catholic historian, estimates that 40 to 50% of the Waffen-SS were communicating Roman Catholics. Not one of them was ever threatened with the smallest punishment for what they did or were doing.
Thank you.
No, don't let's give up. It doesn't mean that there's no relationship between Christianity and morality in this dark hour. Joseph Goebbels was expelled, was excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church. He was. Why? Do you know why? For marrying a Protestant. Magda Goebbels was a Protestant and a divorcee. Joseph Goebbels had the sacraments withdrawn from him. That's the only case I know of a Nazi being threatened with discipline by the Roman Catholic Church. To dare to ask me that question in that tone of voice in this audience, I think shows something really like moral irresponsibility. But that's my reply, and that's the short version. Okay? Try me on this again, and on the relationship between faith and totalitarianism, and I have a lot more for you. Okay? So just keep trying.
Do you believe that Jews who definitionally do not accept Jesus as their Savior or the Trinity or any Christian, specifically Christian doctrine, are saved?
I believe the answer to that is yes, although I would have to explain, but I'll answer in short form, yes.
Okay.
And in fact, by the way, my evidence for this is in the Bible, because there is a scene in the Bible where Abraham, who clearly came before Jesus, didn't know Jesus, didn't accept Jesus, is described as being in heaven. So quite clearly there has to be a mode of salvation applicable to the Old Testament before Jesus that doesn't include Jesus.
It's not fair, but I'm just curious, given that your wife is an evangelical, would she agree with you on that?
I think so, although this calls for further discussion.
Okay, so I have one other question, and that is, you will this evening, to the extent that time would allow, you would be making the argument for the God, specifically the God of Israel. Is that correct?
Yes, I would argue that Christianity takes, if you will, the Jewish idea of God and in some senses universalizes it. I mean, the universal principle is in Judaism. It's not invented by Christianity. But in some senses...
Okay, I just wanted to understand. Go right ahead now.
My turn, right? Okay, and I have... Christopher, I'm going to start with you. Let's begin with this business about religion poisoning everything. Now, I think you would concede that much of what we call Western civilization is built on the pillars of Athens and Jerusalem. If you look at Western art, Western literature, Western sculpture, Western painting. So my question is, isn't it irresponsible to say religion poisons everything? Did religion poison Bach and Dante and Milton and Shakespeare and Raphael and Wren and the designers of the Gothic cathedrals? Can't you concede something good in religion? Let me shift ground. One of the themes that you stressed in your opening statement earlier, and we see it consistently among other of the so-called new atheists, is this equation between Islamic extremism on the one hand and Christianity on the other. Now, in dealing with the Islamic extremism, we could cite 9/11, the Bali bombing, the London bombing, the Madrid bombing, the list goes on. Who today would you say... Let me finish my question. It's my time. It's my time. Who would you say today is the Christian bin Laden? Where's the Christian Al-Qaeda? Where's the Christian Hamas and Hezbollah? Where's the Christian country run today along the lines of Khomeini's Iran? Name them.
But I don't have to. I've never made any such...
Will you admit then that this analogy is specious and that in fact there are fundamental differences between Christianity and Islam that the new atheists have been exploiting to, in a sense, transfer the guilt of Islamic radicalism onto Christianity?
If you had asked me in the 1930s which religious belief I thought was the most threatening to the survival of human society and civilization, I would have said Roman Catholicism because of its very intimate and deep and nasty relationship with fascism. At that stage, the greatest threat to humanity was not jihadism, but at present it is. Religions take their turn at bat. In Northern Ireland, Protestantism has been far more oppressive and obscurantist than Catholicism even for the last half century. I would regard that as anomalous, but there's no way, just as you can't answer my question about why in that case don't you credit the builders of mosques and Aztec temples and Khmer temples too, and say that all of these prove that religion is the origin of civilization. You won't do that because it would be too ecumenical for you.
Dinesh, you have 3 minutes to use as you see fit.
I have 3 more minutes? Oh, I see. I'm going to put one more question to Christopher and then switch to Dennis, if I may. I'm going to come back and answer your points about Hitler and anti-Semitism, so I'm going to hold off on them now. You say in your book, God is Not Great, that you think that Jesus Christ did not even exist. You consider seriously the possibility that he was a fictional character. And I'd like to ask you, by what standard of scholarship do you do this? For example, for Socrates, and I think that there's probably no sane philosopher or historian of philosophy who doubts that Socrates existed, we have only two sources really for Socrates, both admiring disciples, Plato and Xenophon, and they give very different portraits of Socrates. So my question is, if Socrates existed by accepted canons of historical scholarship, on what basis do you deny the historicity, forget the divinity, just the historicity of Christ?
Well, you only had to turn another page and to see that I say that there's no proof of the existence of Socrates either. Oh, I'm so sorry. Dinesh,
what about Alexander the Great? Did he exist?
You only have to turn another page to see my say in my discussion of Athenian philosophy that there's no proof of the existence of Socrates either. I make the point almost as you do. I say it's with the exception of two people who were admirers, we can't be certain that he existed at all, but it doesn't make any difference. Because the Socratic, I can revere the Socratic method without having any need at all to deify or put on a pedestal, make superhuman the person who invented it.
No, the point I'm making is...
I'm sorry, you've just dug a pit, not the first time this evening, you've just dug a pit for yourself with your own hands.
I was just making the point that the historicity of virtually every figure in the ancient world, from Alexander the Great, relies on fragmentary evidence, and so canons of historical scholarship generally accept reliability even when there's partial documentary evidence, if there are no reasons to believe the contrary.
There's no evidence but
You're
hearsay.
elevating the degree of skepticism in dealing with Christ that you would nowhere apply to any other figure.
There is no evidence but the hearsay of fans.
I want to switch to Dennis Prager
and Jesus of Nazareth. Alexander the Great at least has coins with his face on them.
I'm going to put one quick question.
And name.
One question to Dennis Prager, if I may.
Written down by literate people. There's nothing of that for Jesus or Moses.
Christopher, you are engaging in the filibuster. All right.
No, answering the question, I think, otherwise you could have accused me of not doing so. There is no evidence of any kind for the existence of Moses or Jesus. None at all. Of the kind that there is for Alexander the Great. Not to know the difference is not to know the difference.
Let's just say this puts you wide outside the mainstream of the entire living historical community. But let me turn to Dennis Prager.
I've been to the grave sites of the Macedonian royal house. You won't find Jesus' grave in a hurry. And they haven't found Mount Sinai yet.
Yeah,
Go look for Mount Sinai. Tell me when he found it.
Dennis, I'm gonna pose to you a tough question, and I'm a little surprised Christopher hasn't posed it, but it's a problem for me in thinking about Christianity, particularly because of its relationship with Judaism. In looking at the teachings of Christ, you find a counsel of mercy, forgiveness, love, and so on. Even the atheists have a little bit of a hard time, although Christopher strains at the leash here, I have a little bit of a hard time attacking Jesus. It's a little bit hard to denounce the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount. On the other hand, there are some passages in the Old Testament that do give one pause. Ideas of an Old Testament God who seems vengeful, who identifies so completely with one group that the enemies of this group become the enemies of God. These people are wiped out, decimated, their children taken into slavery. How do you explain those passages?
I do explain the passages, and then I have a rebuttal for you then. But first, the enemies of Israel are only wiped out to the extent, first of all, they're never fully wiped out. I mean, but whatever it is, they're certainly warred on and they're decimated, if not wiped out. But in any event, only because of their evil, and the Torah makes that clear. The first 5 books of Moses, that they had to reach a level of evil where they deserved it, and the evil was almost always identified as child sacrifice. That is what the Canaanites engaged in. The greatness of the Hebrew Bible, and since we're now making these comparisons, and everyone here who knows anything about me knows of my gratitude and respect and every good feeling toward America's Christians and toward the contribution of Christianity in this country specifically and elsewhere as well. But if you are going to make that comparison, I find it far more morally troubling that in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, it is filled with Jewish self-criticism. The villains of the Hebrew Bible are the Hebrews, not non-Jews, Jews. But that is not the case in the New Testament. The Christians are terrific. The Jews of the Jewish Bible stink, with a handful of exceptions. The self-criticism, the constant saying about how bad they are. They get out of Egypt, they build a golden calf after all of the miracles. So this comparison is not one I like making, but since you've opened this Pandora's box, I am very welcome to making that comparison. Secondly, the Jews' God judged everybody, including pagans, by their decency, not by their belief. The Jew who reads the New Testament, and I have spectacular respect for what the New Testament has created, especially in the greatest country in the world. But I remember when I first read it, I was stunned at the amount of people who ended up in hell. And this was something totally foreign to me as a Jew, where people were punished solely because they were bad, never because of their wrong beliefs. So, and finally, the God of the Old Testament is the one who said, "Love your neighbor as yourself. I am God." Leviticus 19:18. It's literally the center of the Torah. It's in the middle of the third book of the Bible.
Thank you. I'm quite sure there's more to be said on punishment in hell in the next few minutes. I'm going to suggest, for the sake of time and to allow for questions, that because this is your penultimate statements, let's try and truncate them to 3 minutes, 3 to 4 right now in the rebuttals, and then maybe we'll do more of a worldwide wrestling approach to the final cross-exam.
I said earlier that I fully acknowledge, and every thoughtful religious person acknowledges, the problem of an unjust world. The alternative would have been a perfectly just world. I have a deep desire for a perfectly just world where nothing unjust could happen, nobody could hurt anybody, no man could rape a woman, no parent could abuse a child, where there was no premenstrual syndrome. I mean, there is. I could imagine a perfect world in many ways. Would the world be one worth living in? I don't know. What happens to give meaning to life, ironically, is for one thing, death. I mean, if I knew I was going to live forever, I'm not sure how much I would read, because I know why should I read that book? I could read it 2,000 years from now. Why should I get out of bed? I'm here forever. I don't have perfect answers for this, but the alternative doesn't fill me, frankly, with great desire either. The Jewish view is that God did make an uncompleted world, and it is the human task to repair it, to complete it. That's why the traditional understanding for circumcision on the 8th day, the 7 days of creation, 6 plus the day of rest, and on the 8th day, we're already manipulating nature, as if to say, it wasn't perfect, the human body, we'll make it a little better and get rid of the foreskin. Whatever you have to say about it, it's a symbolic notion that we are here. I don't lament the loss of my foreskin, Christopher, so it is not an issue I want to get into. It's among the many trauma of my life that has not been high on the list.
Never by crackling from a moil.
Okay, now, I do want to say one other thing, though, since I have 1 more minute only. Christopher said it's very possible to have great cultural achievements without the supernatural. Really? Really? May I offer this thought as one who was a part-time orchestral conductor and deeply involved in classical music? By and large, the death of God in the Western world has led to the death of great art. Music since the age of secularism stinks. Art since the age of secularism stinks. What our art galleries are filled with today are fecal matter, urine, menstrual blood, and the like. They are moronic cartoons that fill our galleries. It was only God and the pervasiveness of God in the Western world that produced great art. It is an empty, empty chamber, the secular chamber.
Mr. D'Souza.
I thought I would focus my rebuttal on two themes that I think have been brought front and center in this debate. The first one is the offer of a prize, which always gets my attention. Name a principle of virtue invented by theism. And I'm going to name one invented specifically by Christianity. That is the movement to abolish slavery. Slavery is a universal institution. It's existed in all cultures. For millennia, slavery needed no defenders because it had no critics. Now, for the first time in Western civilization, slavery became controversial. Not just in the modern era. Slavery was abolished in most of Europe between the 4th century and the 10th century. And then starting in the modern era, groups of people, first the Quakers and then the evangelical Christians, took a theological premise, we are all created equal in the eyes of God, and derived from it a political conclusion. Therefore, no man has the right to rule another man without his consent. This idea, this political application of a theological maxim, became the basis not merely of anti-slavery or abolition, but also of modern democracy. Because the premise of modern representative democracy is precisely that no man has the right to rule another without consent. Here is a distinct and I think unarguable historical example. I don't deny there were Christians on the other side of a virtue that was not in the world before the Christians, based on a theological proposition, derived it. There have been no purely atheist anti-slavery movements anywhere. Now, and I want to address the issue of Hitler, because you have to remember that Hitler, in Mein Kampf, says very clearly that I will say anything, propaganda he defines, as lying to achieve a goal. And in the early years, in the 1930s, in fact, if you go to atheist websites, you'll see a lot of quotations in which Hitler seems to endorse Christianity and the cross. You'll notice those quotations are all between about 1933 and they stop about 1936. Why? In the early years, Hitler was trying to win over the Bavarian Catholics and the Lutheran Protestants, and so he invented an Aryan Christ, sort of the killer of the Jews, and tried to sell this to the German churches. They didn't buy it. And so the moment Hitler got to power, and by the way, Hitler's own views on Christianity extensively stated in a book called Hitler's Table Talk, assembled by his own close aides. He dripped with venom and hatred for Christianity. He saw it as the main obstacle to creating a secular, race-based utopia. And the leading people around Hitler, Bormann, Heydrich, Himmler, were avowed atheists who were given the specific charge of undermining and destroying the churches in Germany. All of this is pretty well outlined in Richard Evans' multi-volume History of the Third Reich. So this idea that Hitler was some sort of a closet Christian, complete nonsense. Now, one thing that Christopher does in these debates is he takes the crimes of Christianity and he blames them on Christianity, and then he takes the crimes of atheism and he blames them on Christianity. Now, this is cheating. The philosopher Daniel Dennett said very clearly, and I realize I've just got a few seconds, he said, listen, if Islam is to blame for Hamas and Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda, if there's something about Islam that gave rise to that, and if even the ordinary Muslim must take some responsibility for that, and even if the peace-loving Christian bears some responsibility for the Crusades and the Inquisition and the Salem witch trials, by the same logical token and extension, even the peace-loving atheist, yes, even you, Christopher, bear some responsibility for the horrendous crimes, the ocean of blood and the mountain of bodies. Not just Mao, not just Stalin, even a junior leaguer like Pol Pot. He's a little league atheist, doesn't even make it in the top category. He kills about 2 million in the space of 3 years. So you can't get around that. Atheism was their inspiration and the creation of a new man in a new utopia, liberated from traditional religion and morality. This was, in fact, the goal of those atheist regimes.
Thank you.
If I designed the world, I would have designed it differently as well. I would have definitely made celery fattening and cheesecake healthy. I have innumerable designs that I would have done better than God. I have no doubt about it. Absolutely. But to me, it's meaningless talk. I mean, these are the things that, I argued with kids in the 3rd grade. They'd say, "Dennis, you believe in God?" I'd go, "Yeah." "Oh, really? You think he's all powerful?" I'd go, "Yeah." "Well, is he so strong that he can make a rock so heavy that he can't lift it?" And then they'd walk away thinking they had just, discovered America, that they had just this brilliant insight. Or, well, if everything needs to be started, who started God? These are not serious arguments. God is not natural, so therefore God doesn't need to be started. Only things within nature need to be started because everything in nature did. As for design, of course, I told you, I admit it, I have design questions. But if you look at the spectacular way in which the brain, the eye, the body works, my brother was at Harvard Medical School when he came to firmly believe in God, and he did so looking at the cell. The infinite complexity of just one cell with the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi bodies and everything else that is happening in there. Now, of course, you could say it happened on its own, and that's what I began by saying. Since neither of us has proof for our position, it's, to me, a matter of common sense. That's all. One just asks, what is the likelihood of it coming about on its own versus the likelihood of its having been designed? There are scientists who are also stymied by this question, and they have posited, since they refuse to believe in a supernatural deity, they have posited that extraterrestrials planted seeds here, because it seems so inconceivable that this just happened in earthly terms. Now, as to just a couple of other points that are made, I mean, once a secularist says that North Korea is religious, I think that we have gone beyond the realm of definitional terms. It's a completely secular state. If you are religious in a God-based religion, that's what we're talking about. The debate here was about God. Of course, there are secular religious substitutes for God-based religion. That argues on our behalf, it seems to me, that the human being is designed to find meaning, and that in the godless universe there is no meaning. And of course there isn't. Yeah, there's subjective meaning. I like gardening. I like my kids. Of course there's subjective meaning, but in the final analysis, all is nothing after all. Everything is destroyed. We're all a coincidence anyway. There is no designer. It's all meaningless. Now, here is the question that I'll just have to end with. I just ask you who are atheists to ask yourself the 3 a.m. question. Do you really, really, really believe that in the final analysis, all really is meaningless? It's hard. You see, I go through the other entrance to the building of belief. It's secularism that makes me believe. That is so obvious to me that it's not possible that this is a meaningless world, then there must be a meaning giver. And that is what we call God. Do I have problems? Who thinks and doesn't have problems? But the purpose of life is not to be trouble-free. But one purpose of life is to have meaning, and without God, that's when you end up with what you see in your galleries, and you see the moral chaos of the secular university. Because without God, all is permitted, and because when there is no God, people don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. And these are the things that keep me quite balanced, and with all my doubts, I believe in the God that this Torah revealed to the world.
Thank you.
I must say I love these debates, and I particularly like these rebuttals. I always feel a bit like Winston Churchill said he felt during the Boer War. He said, it's always exhilarating to be shot at without result. So I want to begin by addressing briefly slavery. Remember that slavery was for many centuries like the family. It was taken for granted. Slavery existed in the ancient world, and in fact, you had something very close to what we would consider atheists in the ancient world. Christopher mentioned Lucretius, Epicurus, Aristotle in some sense. He posited a first mover. They were not in any profound way bothered by slavery. Nobody was. Slavery only became controversial within what we could call Christendom. For the first time, slavery had critics. For the first time, there was a movement behind it. That movement would not have existed were it not for Christianity. This point, by the way, can be greatly extended. I mean, for example, human life had very little value in ancient Greece and Rome. The ancient Spartans would leave the sick child on the hillside, happy to find it dead in the morning. That's not the scandal. The scandal is the great atheist thinkers of ancient Greece, Epicurus, Lucretius, Aristotle, knew about this. But they viewed this with complete equanimity. It didn't bother them. It was no big deal. Why? Because the idea of the sacredness and preciousness of every human life, this comes through Judaism to Christianity. These are new things, if you will, that Judaism and Christianity brought into the world. I want to talk about, well, you mentioned Franklin, Jefferson. These were, by the way, the least devout of all the founders. And yet Jefferson, when he wanted to condemn slavery, used surprisingly biblical language. The Almighty can take no side of ours in this kind of a contest. The unbeliever Jefferson became peculiarly devout. And when Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, a considered document, had to locate the source of our rights, he could think of only one, the Creator. No other. This was a man of the Enlightenment who could find no secular sources for rights to appeal to other than transcendent Creator. Finally, a point about, look, the only point I wanted to make about the crimes of religion and atheism are this. Christopher says he doesn't want to feel bad about the Khmer Rouge, and that's fine. But then he proceeds to show that Stalinism and North Korea were really disguised forms of religion. So he's trying to make Dennis and me feel bad about those things, even though we had nothing to do with them any more than he did. So there's a sleight of hand going on here, and that's all I'm objecting to. We need an equal calculus. If you read Henry Kamen's multi-volume study of the Inquisition, you discover that over a period of some 350 years, the Spanish Inquisition, which was the worst, killed about 2,000 people. Now, that's 2,000 too many, but 2,000 people over I'm not a math major, it works to about 5 guys a year. This is not a world historical crime. An ordinary atheist on a good afternoon would wipe out multiples of these people. Now, Christopher Hitchens Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion, says, but wait a minute. The atheists, the Christians killed in the name of Christianity. You might have had tyrants who happened to be atheists, but they didn't kill in the name of atheism. Now, see, Dawkins is an accomplished biologist, but there's a bit of a problem when you let a biologist leave the lab, because here's a guy with no understanding whatsoever of history. You just have to crack open the Communist Manifesto to see that atheism isn't incidental. It is integral to the Marxist philosophy. Religion is the opium or the opiate of the masses. The idea is to create a society in which religion is abolished, and class, and in the case of the Nazis, race, replaces traditional religious loyalties as the ultimate allegiance of man. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Prager.
Well, I can only speak for myself that I have the idiosyncratic tendency to only talk about the topic. The topic is the Christian God, the Jewish God.
Well, now's
no
your chance,
God.
then.
Okay, I didn't interrupt you. The topic was not the case for religion. The topic was about God. God or no God. Specifically the Christian perception, the Jewish perception, or the atheist perception of no God. That's what we discussed.
Exactly.
Now, that's because that was the topic and that's what we were invited to discuss. However, now having been invited to discuss where is the transition made from the Creator God to a religion and a series of beliefs, I'll offer you in a nutshell a Jewish response. If there is a God who created the human, then it strikes me, again, purely on logical grounds, that God would care about how the humans that God created fare. If we care about how humans fare, it would seem that the Creator of us would care how we fare, or we are superior to our Creator. I find that notion possible, but unlikely. So the odds are that God did care if we were good to each other. And so this is my read, that God implants a conscience in the human being. It obviously failed, and whether you take it as an allegory or literally, and I am more toward the allegorical, but it's irrelevant. I'm totally happy with those who take it literally. It means nothing to me which way you go. The very first two human beings are brothers, and one murders the other. Clearly, something goes awry very quickly. And so God then destroys the world because he's interested in our being good. I have never had a moral problem with Noah's flood. I'm not even arguing for a literal understanding. I'm arguing for taking the story and what it means. It means that God wants goodness to prevail. If it doesn't, there is no purpose to human life. He starts over again and gives Noah a series of laws to live by, since conscience was not enough. That doesn't work, and God makes a third attempt to make the world better and gives a very explicit revelation of moral law to a small people, a particularly miserable people, a particularly ugly people, and a particularly small people called Hebrews. They are slaves. Slave mentality is a very low form, the lowest form of human mentality. And God chooses this tiny group, not because it's at all better. In fact, the Bible itself says you're not better than anybody else. In fact, you're smaller. You're nothing. And if that group can elevate itself among the peoples and be in some ways a moral light, which Jews have been, despite the number of miserable Jews as there are miserable peoples of any group, but Judaism did give Christianity, did give the moral ideals that the Western world lives by, and Jews did become a people that elevated itself in many ways. Then it's ascribed to this third revelation from Adam, the conscience, to Noah, a universal a series of few laws, to a lot of laws to one people to try to embody it. Now, I would like to add at this point a fourth. Can you give me a minute?
40 seconds.
How did we go from a minute to 20 seconds inside of 10 seconds?
30.
All right, I will just.
1 minute.
Okay, there is something
She's
I
the
want
equivalent of God on this podium.
I'm sorry? Oh, there we go.
She's playing God on the podium.
Correct. I do want to add something here, because then comes Christianity, and I want to just, the time factor is more troublesome than even on radio when I have to break for commercials. But nevertheless, it's inevitable, and I appreciate that. A very quick word on how this religious Jew sees Christianity, because you heard how a religious Christian sees Judaism. I believe that Christianity, when rooted in the Hebrew Bible, as indeed Christianity in America certainly has been, this has been a very Judeo-Christian Christianity in America. I believe it is an expression of divine will. I do not believe that there is only one road to God, nor does Judaism. The most Orthodox Jew in the world, the most insular, most isolated Orthodox Jew would never say that only Jews can reach God or only Jews are saved. It has never, ever, ever been a Jewish position. Those who come to this God and to this 10 Commandments, these are doing God's will. I see the Christians of America having done God's will, and a form, if you will, of divine revelation in its way. And that is the reason many Christians find it remarkable how much I defend Christians. But after all, Dennis, don't you believe there's only one truth? I believe there's only one empirical truth, but I don't believe there is only one way to God, and nor does my religion. And so I just want to explain how I can accommodate so well, while being a truly believing Jew, how I can so accommodate to the achievement of the Christian, especially in America, where we share this basic body of values called Judeo-Christian.
Thank you.
It's particularly delightful and challenging to debate these issues from sort of multiple perspectives. If Christopher feels a little bit of excessive ecumenism on the side of Dennis and me, I'm going to be departing from that in just a moment. But I do want to say a couple of things first. And that is the problem of evil, the problem of cruelty, of harsh, unnecessary suffering, is often posed as an exclusive dilemma or difficulty for the believer. I want to suggest it is no less a difficulty for the atheist. And why? Because if we are Darwinian primates, driven by an imperative to survive and reproduce, we would in general only commit that evil which was necessary to that end. The amount of evil in the world, its scale, staggers the mind. It has no reproductive benefit. It has no survival advantage. Look at the animal kingdom. You might have a lion that wants to eat an antelope, but you don't have a lion that wants to wipe out all the antelopes off the face of the planet. In a sense, when we see horrible things, a serial killer, we say that was a bestial act you did, but it's wrong. Beasts don't act that way. So there is something peculiar about the nature of man that makes him capable of a degree of evil that goes way beyond Darwinian necessity, requires almost an alternative explanation. Now,
because he's created in God's image.
No. Now, what I want to say is, why have the atheist killings of the 20th century been so terrible? I think the answer is simple. Christopher mentioned earlier Dostoevsky's maxim, if God is not, everything is permitted. I want to give you Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche, probably the greatest atheist thinker of the last 150 years, his interpretation of this. But basically what Nietzsche says is that if you remove God, many people want to get rid of God, but hang on to the morality that the idea of God brought into the world. But you really can't do this. If you get rid of God, you get rid of the foundation of those values that emanated out of the transcendent idea. For example, the simple idea that you owe equal respect and dignity, not just to a family member or a neighbor, but to a complete stranger. From a Darwinian point of view, this is completely senseless. There is absolutely no reason that one should extend bonds of sympathy, for example, to someone starving in Rwanda. They are nothing to me. We have no genes in common. Now, religion is a theory of cosmic justice. If you think of the Hindu idea of reincarnation, you were a jerk in the way you've acted, well, you're going to be a cockroach in your next life. So religion introduces the idea that even though life is unfair, and many times in life the bad guy ends up on top and the good guy comes to grief, there will be a final accounting in the end in which what goes around comes around. And I want to submit that theists who did bad things had to pay attention to this. Even if Torquemada was a horrible guy, if he was a believer, he had to worry about the Last Judgment. But Stalin did not, and Mao did not, and Pol Pot did not. Do I have a moment for a final thought about Christianity?
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Human beings are at this level, down here, but we have within us this aspiration to perfection, perfect beauty, perfect justice, perfect truth. Man is down here, God is up here. I see most of the religions of the world as trying to create a ladder from man to God. Follow these rules, perform these diets, obey these commandments. It's the premise of Christianity that these ladders, however well constructed, cannot reach their destination. It's too high. Man can't get up there. God has to come down. God has to condescend to the human level. That's the only way to close the chasm. And so in Christ, symbolically, we see, in a sense, God becoming man, a way to reach down to man, bridge that gap, and open up an opportunity, you might say, for human salvation. Thank you.
Revealed himself to his people. Today, folks, including Richard Dawkins, ask, why doesn't God just reveal himself again and end the argument about his existence once and for all? Do you think there's any chance he might?
There is a chance he might. I've asked this question often. What is it Woody Allen has said in one of his movies? If just God would sneeze. I would be happy. All I just want is a sneeze, and that would be sufficient. My belief is that if God did some spectacular miracle, the heavens lit up all over the world, and in hundreds of languages, clouds formed the words, "I am God, you better take care of each other," it would have an impact for approximately 3 days. For some people, forever. But immediately there would be explanations of cloud formations that scientists would come up with. It wouldn't matter. That's the brilliance of the story, to my mind, at any rate, in the Bible, and where the Jews are shown all these miracles and then end up building a golden calf anyway. I mean, shortly after, the sea was split, and they still built a golden calf. That is human nature, because we always ask, what did you do for me today? That's the way it is. We are children in many ways, and God is this paternalistic figure. And just as our children don't walk around thinking, my God, you diapered me all those years? Wow. I mean, how many babies say, I've prevented my parents from having intimacy for the last 3 months. I'm going to shut up tonight. It just doesn't happen. The human is not built in with gratitude. And so the same thing with God. It's, what did you do for me lately? So I don't think it would work if God did make some revelation. And finally, I don't think there's anything for God to reveal. There's nothing new to be said. It's been said. There's nothing new to be said. It is our task. There is an instruction manual that I believe in, and if you follow it, generally speaking, people are kinder. And if you don't follow it, or you pervert it, then obviously bad happens. But I don't know, what is God going to add today? What exactly? Don't abuse children? Don't build gas chambers? What hasn't been said? It's been said. It's our task to say either I will live by it or not. But that's my answer to that question.
Actually, there is nothing against child abuse or genocide in the Ten Commandments, since you happen to mention this.
Well, there is. There's do not murder. There is. Murder means the immoral killing of an innocent. So there is, in fact, a prescription.
There's nothing for child abuse and nothing against genocide.
Well,
genocide is about to be recommended against the Amalekites only a few pages later.
Yes, against the Amalekites, it is one exception because of a horrific evil. It never happened, but that it is prescribed. I have no answer to it, just as I cannot tell you that if God, people say, well, what if God told you to sacrifice your child, like he told Abraham?
And no condemnation of slavery or child abuse.
Okay. God, well,
but of coveting, yes.
Of
envy, yes. Of ambition, yes.
Okay.
This is obviously man-made, and man-made at a time of Stone Age morality. Okay. There's no divine presence or inspiration in it at all. Surely that must be plain.
Oh, well, that is a matter of opinion. My opinion is that the break with everything preceding the Old Testament, specifically the first 5 books, is so enormous that you have to either explain its authors as supermen or some divine authorship involved. The notion that there is an invisible God who prefers goodness to evil was unknown in the world. The idea that this life is to be celebrated. Remember, Judaism arose out of Egypt. In Egypt, the Book of the Dead was the Bible. The pyramids were the great works of art, and they were tombs. The Egyptians celebrated death. And it was that Torah coming out of Egypt that said, I have put before you life and death, and you shall choose life. It is an utterly life-centered idea in the midst of a death-centered world. Ironically, Israel is, to this day, 2008, still in a death-centered world.
May I have a brief response? God is in the Abrahamic tradition, and in fact, I think for all the major religions, an immaterial being. And there is something inherently ridiculous in demanding a material proof of an immaterial being. You have to ask, what is the kind of evidence that would convince me? So, for example, gravity is immaterial. Now, not the effects of gravity. If I jump out of a tall tower, I plummet to the ground. But that's me. Gravity is the law describing what I did. Where do we find gravity? We infer it from its effects. So the question is, we have here a universe. It had a beginning. Presumably didn't create itself. Who created it? Or what created it? That what can't be natural. The universe includes everything, all of nature. It has to be non-natural, let us say supernatural. It has to be pretty powerful, maybe not all powerful, but close to it. That we call God. Now, in one of my debates with the atheist Michael Shermer, I told him, I said, what kind of proof would convince you that God exists? What if you found a planet that had emblazoned on it, Yahweh made this? Would you convert on the spot? And he said no. He said, I can think of no evidence whatever that would convince me. In a sense, I guess what we're getting at here is, there is here, I think, not only, and I think on the part of Russell too, a refusal to believe, but an atheism that has explanations other than simply the absence of evidence. In some senses, Christopher got close to it earlier in this debate where he said, to me, God is a bit like a celestial despot. Heaven is sort of like celestial North Korea. I don't want to stand there handing out garlands for eternity. I don't want to go to that kind of place. So it's not as if God is grabbing the unbeliever and flinging him into hell. God is making heaven available to everyone, and the atheist of his free will is saying, I don't want to go there.
That's right.
I have come to this conclusion. Whatever belief brings you to the God of Israel, that I believe is indeed the true God, whatever belief brings you to that and brings you to the goodness that is demanded by that God has my blessings and has Judaism's blessings and may very well be divine will. So I have an almost heretical view of Jesus to many Christians. I think he came to non-Jews. I don't think he came to Jews because there would have been no reason for Jews at the time, no good reason, to have said, oh, look at that, God came. There's no notion in Judaism of God coming in human flesh. I argue with Jewish friends, interestingly, just had this argument this last Sabbath at our Shabbat meal. I said, I fully can entertain the idea that God can do anything, including come in human form. But that's separate from why Jews would have believed that at the time. There would have been no reason. Moreover, Judaism has always held that if the Messiah came, and that's an entirely separate belief from a divine belief in Jesus, which doesn't have a Jewish precedent of a human being God or a Trinity. These are new beliefs that Jews would have looked and said, gee, I don't know, what are you talking about? But I do believe that the Jews were not doing what they were supposed to do, which is to spread the belief in this one God to the world. And so some Jews, after all, Christianity is founded by Jews, some Jews took it upon themselves to take the Jewish God to the world, dropped circumcision, dropped the Jewish national identity, dropped most Jewish rituals, and said, there is now a universal way to get there without all the difficulties of Jewish law, Jewish nationality, ethnicity, etc. And indeed, according to the greatest Jewish philosopher who ever lived, Maimonides, it was Christian. More Christians have brought more people to the Torah than Jews have. That's a historical fact. So how can I look at Christianity? And I wrote a book, part of which is about Christianity and anti-Semitism. I don't deny it. I wrote a book in part on it. But what Christians did bad is a fact, and what Christianity did good is also a fact. I can chew gum and walk at the same time. And he was absolutely right about Henry Kamin's book on the Inquisition. And the constant raising of the Inquisition idea without people knowing the small number, every one of which is a defamation of Christianity and an evil beyond words, but nevertheless, in the annals of human evil is minuscule. This is where one needs to have a fair understanding. I see Christianity when it works as God's work. I do.
but I do not believe that Jesus came to the Jews to say that he is God. If I believed that, I would be a Christian, obviously.
Thank you. Final question for Mr. D'Souza. Let's do one more for Dinesh and one more for Christopher, and then we'll call it a night. Mr. D'Souza, you've written that atheism does not have much to offer in the way of consolation when one is suffering. But I'd like to go back to the basic question of Job. Why does the all-powerful God of the Jewish and the Christian scriptures allow suffering at all? Surely he could have come up with a better way to draw us to him.
This is maybe one of the oldest questions faced by believers. And as you noted, the example of Job, the atheists often present the problem as though they invented it. But in fact, it's an ancient problem within the orbit of belief. Now look, the problem is only a problem if stated in a narrow way. God is compassionate. We've got suffering and injustice. Therefore, this God could not exist. Stated that way, the proposition cannot be disputed. But this is a proposition that relies on stating a theist or Christian premise and then refuting it. So you got to state the premise fully. The premise is not God in his compassion created a perfect world, but God is compassionate but also just. God created a universe, but he also created a universe according to law. And that is to say not only moral laws, but physical laws. Now, there is natural evil that results from physical laws. There's a drought, or there is a tsunami, and people are killed. The only way for those to be suspended would be for our universe not to operate according to physical laws, not to live in a lawful universe, which, by the way, would make science impossible. Second, moral evil. We are created with free will. And that means that people can do terrible things. Free will can be used well, or it can be used badly. The alternative for God would be to create automatons, which he didn't. It's not clear that would be a better world. So God didn't do the Holocaust. Hitler and his minions did. I think ultimately, as humans, we will never fully answer these problems, but I think you touched on something very important in the beginning where you said that while theism may not be able to fully explain evil, atheism offers absolutely no psychological or emotional compensation for it. If we face suffering, a mother or I as a father lose a child, I'm less concerned with why did that happen and more with how do I go on? How do I face this level of grief? In that, atheism has nothing to offer. Things happen. Too bad for you. We're all molecules. Get used to it. Religion offers hope. Listen, you lost a loved one, but that loved one is in the arms of God. You might see that loved one again. Call it wishful thinking if you will, but the point is neither of us knows if that's true. The bottom line of it is for the suffering mother, theism offers consolation, and atheism does not.
Thank you. Christopher, final question. Several queries along the same lines of this tonight here. Where does your morality originate? Why aren't the various massacres, holocausts, and genocide simply the process of natural selection? And on a parallel track, why do humans, from your interpretation, appeal to a sense of justice and fairness when, in fact, there are so very few, if any, examples of either in this world?
Did I not just do my stuff about the golden rule? Haven't I just, in fact, couldn't I have a question I haven't already answered? Or haven't you just answered 2 minutes ago? It seems like a waste of a question to make me go through all that again. In the meantime, I will just add that it's certainly true of religion that it offers consolation.
All right.
Can I then?
It does. It tells you all kinds of consoling things. There's no doubt about that.
You didn't
well,
do
let's-
justice to the question. The question wasn't what do you believe. That's what you answered when you spoke about the golden rule. It asked what the source is.
That's what I was saying. That's
No,
what I said.
we
the
want to
source
know
was.
your source. Your source seems to be your opinion. Well, what if my opinion is I would like to screw
There is
everybody
all right,
unless
I
they
will,
screw me
or
first?
If you like, I'll remind you of what I
standard.
said. I don't mind reminding you. I said it will not be found that there has ever been a human society where courage and strength and care for others is despised, where savagery, adultery, theft, perjury, and so on are thought of as morally neutral or not to be condemned. I'm sorry, I bore myself when I repeat. I'm very much afraid of boring other people if I do it.
Well, it may bore you, but it doesn't answer the question.
And I didn't say this is my opinion.
We still do not have a clue as to where your source is. It's your opinion.
I did not say that was my opinion. I said I don't think it will be found that there has ever been.
That's a non sequitur. You won't find a society that didn't have slavery. What's your argument? The ubiquity of a principle does not mean a thing.
Christopher, may I reformulate the question slightly and pose it to you in a way I think you'll find challenging?
More interesting, yes, maybe.
Okay. You said that the golden rule, this idea of reciprocity, this idea, for example, of extending respect to others as universal, and maybe it is. What I want to know is, what is its Darwinian explanation? In other words, I can understand why, as a mother might jump into a burning car to save her 2 children. They share her genes. She's got a genetic kinship. I can understand why a businessman might treat a customer well. He has a Machiavellian motive. He wants the customer to come back. I scratch your back, you scratch my back. But I don't understand why someone would get up and give their seat to a 75-year-old lady in a bus. I don't think the person doing that is hoping to get her seat next week. Why would you give blood? Why would a soldier die for his country? Why would somebody do something for total genetic strangers? This kind of goodness appears to have no Darwinian explanation. So what is it?
Well, actually, the Darwinian explanation isn't as bad as you might think. But by the way, Darwin doesn't say that evolution is a form of perfection. Natural selection is not at all a form it's a very crude form, if you like. Extremely crude form. It's not, by pointing out that it exists, we don't recommend it. We don't say it is the source of morality. It says these are the kinds of mammals and primates that you're dealing with. This is how they came to be. It was earlier absurdly suggested by somebody that God wouldn't create people who didn't care about them. Well, how does that work for sheep? How does that work for rats? How does that work for viruses? How did that work for dinosaurs? I think it's entirely thinkable that there could be a prime mover who didn't care about his creation. But I'm digressing from my point about, say, blood donation, which happens to be my favorite example, and when I was a socialist was my favorite example. How is it that the British National Health Service never runs out of blood and never charges for it either, and never pays a donor to give it? How is it that people step forward and say, you can have a pint of mine for the general good? Well, one reason, if you want just to not get too moistly idealistic about it, is if you give a pint of blood, you aren't actually a pint short. The beauty of it is you give a pint and someone else gets it, but you haven't lost one, because you'll replenish it after a nice strong cup of tea, which they'll give you in the British National Health Service in the recovery room. So how nice. Someone else is a pint better off and you're not a pint worse off. I can't think of a better way of saying that human solidarity doesn't depend either on self-interest or on self-sacrifice, that it is a rational calculation. And we don't know quite why this is, but it is the case. Quite a lot of people, including those of us who have no belief in any supernatural power or creator, feel better. We benefit in this way. We feel better for having done it. We get pleasure from the thought of helping someone who can't do us a favor. It's called the gift relationship in the Great Socialist Statement by Professor Titmuss about the origins of the blood donor movement. It isn't a reciprocal, it isn't a quid pro quo, it's just in the general interest and you feel good about having done it. And furthermore, since you have to insist on, and I think rightly, the possibility that there's a rational self-interest involved, I happen to have an extremely rare blood group. And one day I'm going to need some blood. So it is in my interest that the blood banks be properly manned, properly staffed, and regularly replenished. Now, all of that, everything that I've just said, makes perfect sense to everyone, I presume, not because it's me talking, but because I haven't left anything out, and it's its own explanation and its own justification. And it works without any divine intervention or prompting at all of any kind.
Perhaps
Thank you.
Along the same lines, though, at what point do animals share the same sense? Do other primates share the same sense of right and wrong as we do? And do they adhere to the golden rule? At what stage is this?
Well, the higher primates do, and we're learning much more and more about how apes and pigs and many others have elementary families and kinships and clan. We'd be very late in studying this kind of thing. The more we find out, the more moving it is. And it's obviously based upon self-interest and survival. And it is selective for survival and for reproduction and so forth. And I suppose there could be people who would say that also was evidence of a divine design, but then that would somewhat degrade the idea that we, the human mammals, the human primates, are a special creation. And as I say, these are the sorts of problems that don't exist in my world, because I don't invent difficulties of this kind, and I don't have to.
May I have a very brief thought?
Yes, and that will...
I do think that as human beings, we do have some unusual qualities that are inexplicable on a strictly Darwinian account. I can fully understand as evolved creatures why we would develop a brain to survive, to be able to elude the woolly mammoth, to kill the prey. I don't understand why we've evolved a brain that can understand the rotation of the planets. I don't think that man 5,000 years ago had to figure those things out in order to survive. I don't know why we would have evolved higher mathematics, the love of beauty. The point is not that we feel good when we do good things. The point is, why would that emotion have survived the Darwinian selection? Machiavelli would tell you that it's much better to be bad and appear good. That's the guy who's going to end up on top. The fellow who actually is good is going to come to grief. So why weren't all the virtuous people eliminated from the face of the earth? Because the cunning and the survivors are the ones who got to make the most descendants. The very fact that we live in a universe where all of us live in a dimension of this is the way we act, but there's a little voice that often calls us to act against self-interest. I'm walking on the riverbank. I'm not a good swimmer. Somebody shouts out, "Help, help, I'm drowning." I have every Darwinian imperative to keep walking. But if I do, I know I'm going to feel bad. Some little voice inside of me says, you should have helped that person, even at a risk to your own genes and your own survival. What is the source of that little voice? It seems to have, if you will, a transcendent source. And if you don't want to call it God, you can call it universal morality. But it's within us. It is the empirical datum we're looking for, and it points to something higher than ourselves. Thank you.